Welcome. I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting hour or so, and I'd like to pass it to Dick, who's going to guide you through.
Thank you very much. It's very exciting for us. Exciting because we've got 6 very special people that bring their stories about undue influence in different ways, but still it's undue influence. We're going to be doing a workshop this weekend where over 50 attendees will be at a workshop talking about undue influence, how to heal from undue influence. And again, I want to thank the college for allowing us to do this. And Lloyd Evans has done a lot of the work to make this possible. He's going to be the first person to chat, but I also want to credit Sue Hall for helping get everything organized. So I'm going to let them do all the talking. So Lloyd, if you want to introduce yourself and tell your story.
Okay. Well, my name is Lloyd Evans. I'm the senior editor of jwsurvey.org, and I am a former Jehovah's Witness. And I want to repeat what's been said. It's very kind of you all to be here this afternoon to discuss what many would regard as a taboo subject. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. I regard it as an epidemic that is raging in our society. It afflicts young and old, rich and poor. It breaks up families. It causes depression, can lead to suicide. It can radicalise bright, educated young men and turn them into monsters capable of almost anything. It can convince Hollywood megastars that they must purge aliens from their bodies in order to lead happy lives. It can convince otherwise loving parents to allow their children to die on a hospital bed for want of a relatively routine medical treatment. And it can lead to pedophilia running rampant in an organisation whose religious leaders recognise it as a crime, or at least say it's a crime, but aren't quite prepared to report all instances of it or all accusations of it. I'm obviously talking about undue influence. Now, undue influence is not just some catchy buzzword that we've dreamt up to bring you all here. It is a legal expression, it's recognised by legal professionals, and it's basically ruining and ending lives, not just here in the UK, but around the world. Now, as to what undue influence actually is, its methods, its techniques, we have some people here who are far more qualified than me to explain the nuts and bolts of it. But if you're anything like me, you'll want to know not just how it works, but what it feels like. What does it feel like to be unduly influenced? Well, in my allocated time, I just want to give you a brief thumbnail sketch of what it's like to, number one, realise that everything that you have been taught in your life is an absolute lie. And number two, realise that there is no way of extricating yourself from that without suffering the worst possible form of punishment, and I'm referring to family estrangement. So you see, when I was 11, I was baptised as a Jehovah's Witness, and I took it very seriously. I would do about 70 hours per month in the preaching work, and then when I was about 20, the penny started to drop. I started to realise that a lot of witness teachings made very little sense whatsoever. But all of that awakening, that formative awakening, got put on hold when my mother died, when I was 21. Now, it's a tragedy for any parent to die. But for you to be told, well, your mother isn't really quite dead. she's still alive in Jehovah's memory. And the way for you to be reunited with her in a paradise world is for you to absolve yourself of all of your personal aspirations, all of your personal goals, and commit yourself, pledge yourself to being obedient to an organisation for the rest of your life. And that tends to put the brakes on any kind of awakening when you've been raised with that kind of thinking. So fast forward 12 years, I'm 34, I've realised that it isn't the truth, it isn't what I'd been raised to believe it was. I'm living in Croatia with my wife, she's expecting our baby who's since been born, and I'm due to appear at an apostasy trial. My website, JW Survey, has been discovered by my local elders, and they want to talk to me about it. And 3 elders will play judge, jury, and executioner. There'll be no independent arbiter. And on the evening of my apostasy trial, I get an email. And the email is from my father, who also happens to be an elder. And my father says basically that he will be shunning me once this hearing is over, because I'm leaving his faith. And since that hearing, since that apostasy trial, he's been joined in shunning me by my sister and her family and various other extended family members, simply because I'm no longer a Jehovah's Witness and I'm not afraid to say so. Now, you might be thinking, well, we feel sorry for you. It's a very sad thing you've gone through, but you do realise that there can be no law on religious belief. You were raised with this religion, and lots of religious people go through far worse consequences for their religious beliefs, and I would agree with you there. As distasteful as it may be to many, myself included, religions must have the right to teach utter falsehood among their followers, because the only alternative to this is for us to live in a world where our beliefs are dictated to us, and we cannot have that. One's freedom of thought, conscience and religion is enshrined under Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document I consider to be the absolute benchmark in human morality, and such freedom must never be violated. However, though the majority of religions tend to operate within the parameters of human rights, every now and then you will get a rogue religion that just trespasses slightly beyond the parameters and commits a violation of human rights. And it would be nice to think that when that happens, civilized society reacts in outrage, in utter horror. How is this happening? But the truth is, in most cases, society is completely indifferent. And worse still, in some cases, it even not just tolerates this violation, it even assists it in some ways. And that's precisely what has happened with Jehovah's Witnesses, and particularly the issue of shunning. Since 1981, it has been impossible to leave Jehovah's Witnesses without facing punishment if your family are also witnesses. In that year, the Watchtower leaders decided that anyone who wishes to leave the witness religion must be treated as though they have done something wrong, as though they have been disfellowshipped. And in case you're wondering how a disfellowshipped witness is to be treated, I have some material to read to you that is literally scorching hot off the press. It's from the very latest study edition of the Watchtower magazine. And it says, this is the November 15th, 2014 issue. A heart-rending experience for Aaron's family is recorded at Leviticus 10, 1-11. They must have been devastated when fire from heaven consumed Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, at the tabernacle. What a test of faith it was for Aaron and his family not to mourn their dead relatives. Are you personally proving yourself holy with regard to not associating with family members or others who have been disfellowshipped? Now, it doesn't take much reading between the lines to figure out how this is to be interpreted by witnesses who are reading it. If you are a witness and you have family members who are disfellowshipped or, in my case, disassociated, you are to treat them not just as though they're dead, you're to treat them as though they have been killed by God, and as such, you are not to mourn them, you are not to grieve them. You must be completely indifferent to the fact that they are or should be a part of your lives. So here we have a direct injunction that flies in the face of Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that it's not just our right to have a religion, it's our right to be able to leave our religion, a right that we all have, all of us here in this room. Now, this disgraceful propaganda from the Watchtower effectively says, no, witnesses aren't free to leave their religion. They must be punished for leaving as though they have been executed by God. And as outrageous and morally contemptible as I believe this is, here's the kicker, ladies and gentlemen. Jehovah's Witnesses in the United Kingdom are not just tax exempt. They are a registered charity. The material I've just read to you has been published by a UK charity, and I'm actually in the process of a formal complaint to the Charity Commission on this and other issues. Charity number 1077961, if you're taking notes. And I understand they're currently being investigated as part of a statutory inquiry. I can only hope that common sense will prevail and they will realise that it is not acceptable for a charity to be publishing material that directly leads to family members coercing of family members to shun one another. Now, I'm almost out of time, but before we pass things on, I just want to list 3 simple things that need to happen if we're going to take undue influence seriously. Number 1, organisations that use undue influence to violate people's human rights should be denied tax-exempt or charitable status. Number 2, our young people need to be inoculated against undue influence in school as early as possible so that they can be made aware of the techniques that will be used on them by friends and family members. And 3, those who fall victim of undue influence should have support when it comes to ridding themselves of it. And it would be nice to think that in the 21st century all of those things would be a given, but unfortunately that's not the case. I've probably gone over with my allocated time, but it's an absolute honour to introduce to you Masoud Banisadr, who will take you through the next part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Masoud Banisadr, and I was member of Mujahideen Khalq organization. Since a few years ago, it was recognized as a terrorist organization, not only in Iran, which they were operating, but also in United States and European Union. In 1996, I was here to finish my PhD study in mathematical engineering and chemical engineering, which I was recruited by this group. Then they were a political organization promoting human rights, democracy, freedom, and this kind of values which everybody respects. Unfortunately, in matter of 2 years, they changed from a political organization into clandestine terrorist organization, and soon they changed us from who we were into who we became, and they changed themselves into a destructive cult. The first suicide bombers, I think, probably in modern times, and at least within Islamic ideology, was done by MEK and in the mosque, killing many people in the mosque, and also I should note for the first time by a woman suicide bomber for the first time blew herself up and with herself killed so many in the mosque. Fortunately, I was their representative in United States, in United Nations, for almost 10 years, and fortunately in 1996 I woke up and I left the group. The group in 1990 forced all members to divorce their spouses and to leave their children. So in one day all members had to divorce and accept celibacy for the rest of their life and leave their children. This is how destructive this group were, and I have to say all members accepted these terms, and it was for everybody except the leader. What I am trying to talk today in allocated time that I have is the relation between terrorism, cult, and mind manipulation, or as Steve calls it, undue influence. In my view, I believe terrorism is some kind of virus, like any other virus that we know, HIV or these days Ebola. It attacks us through our weaknesses, through our vulnerability, and it kills us, if not our body, but it kills our personality and our individuality. What are these vulnerabilities? I call it 3 open gates towards our mind, especially minds of young people and these days young Muslims. The first one is injustice, discrimination, injustice, and double standard. I think terrorism exists because of injustice. It has been with us since the beginning of the civilization, and I am afraid it is going to be with us probably till the end of the civilization. Young people are vulnerable. I mean, they feel, they see the injustice, and they become frustrated, angry, raged, and they feel they have to do something about it. So it opens the first gate towards their mind. Then comes ideology or religion. Somebody comes with ideology and religion claiming he has the solution. Here in the West and these days everywhere probably, these are Wahhabi preachers who come from Saudi Arabia, the main export of Saudi Arabia after oil to other countries. They come with their black and white worldview and narrow-minded interpretation of jihad and shahada, holy war and martyrdom, and claim that they have the solution for these young people how to deal injustice. But both injustice and even Wahhabi ideology doesn't make a person a terrorist or a human bomb. It might change him into angry and even violent person, but not a terrorist. The third open gate is the gate toward terrorism, and that is mind manipulation or undue influence. Let me go back to terrorism and say, how do I define terrorist organizations? Main or principal or sole tactic or behavior towards outside world is terrorism. Therefore, I differentiate these organizations, terrorist organizations, from political organizations that have many different tactics and behavior towards outside world, towards their enemies. They might even commit terrorism, but it is not their only tactic. Terrorist organizations, their only tactic is terrorism. I claim terrorist organizations to survive either are a destructive cult, or to survive they have no alternative but to change into one. Why? Because if I use the same metaphor, viruses have two set of beliefs, two aims and objectives. The first one is self-preservation or existence. The second one is reproduction or expanding their territory. These are just two, and they don't abide or respect any other norms, principles, and culture. Okay, now, who are the members or those who are recruited by terrorist organizations? People, ordinary people like you and me from the society, even intellectual ones. Probably I mentioned that I was a PhD student, and still I was recruited by these groups. These people who have been recruited by terrorist organizations, they have the same set of values, beliefs, and culture as other people in the society. So either terrorist organizations have to change these people from who they are into a terrorist, or they will lose them. This is why they have to use some sort of mind manipulation technique to change their members. This is their path towards changing into a destructive cult. Now, how do we face them? How do we face other viruses, let's say HIV or Ebola these days? Do we bomb them, or do we kill their victims, those who have been infected by these diseases? Yes, we might isolate them from the rest of society to save other people, but we do not kill them, we cure them. And what do we do with the virus itself? We know that viruses, like parasites, another metaphor for destructive cults and terrorists, cannot survive without hosts or without substantial number of hosts. So if we immunize those people, those who are vulnerable toward these diseases, with vaccinating them, then they will lose any host, and with not having enough hosts, they will fade away or they will die away. So what I am trying to suggest is how we can immunize people. Unfortunately, we cannot do much about injustices because governments, and I am sorry to say even media, have the habit of ignoring injustices and pretending showing a rosy picture that everything is fine. So they are not only part of the solution, but part of the problem. They aggravate young people even more, and they increase their anger. So we cannot, I am afraid, do much about the first gate. We cannot close it. What about the second one, preachers? I am afraid again, Saudi preachers are coming along with petrol money of Saudi Arabia. They are hand in hand. And as long as West loves those petrol monies, they have to bear the preachers as well. So we have them as well, and it looks like we cannot do much about it. So the only way which we can face these terrorists is to close the third gate. Their vulnerability towards mind manipulation, towards being influenced by terrorist cult leaders, destructive cult leaders, and so on. Here, we can do something. We can educate people to understand what is undue influence and how they can protect themselves. They might become violent, but they will not change into a terrorist. Thank you. Sorry, let me introduce the next speaker, our dear Linda Dubrow-Marshall, which I am friend of for several years. Thank you very much. Sorry.
I've made some of my best friendships through my work in destructive cults because they're just wonderful people that are trying to think creatively and critically about this important area. Let me tell you where I come from. I'm a clinical and counseling psychologist. I'm a counselor, psychotherapist. I'm an academic and researcher. My first research study in psychology was about how groups could pressure individuals to make anti-Semitic remarks. I'm a Jewish person. I was very intrigued by the Nazis as a cult. I wanted to know not the Nazi leaders, because I thought they might, be psychopathic people, but ordinary people, good family people, went home to their families and were loving, and during the day were torturing and killing people. I wanted to know, how can this happen? And so I looked at university students. Could they be manipulated to say things that they didn't believe in short periods of time? And this started my interest in cultic groups. Because I am a clinician and interested in helping people that are facing these kinds of problems, I also saw the need to provide psychotherapy services to individuals and families who have been affected by destructive cults. But another thing that I realized in the beginning was that that work was different from other work that I do. It required a different kind of approach. Frankly, it wasn't something I'd been trained how to do. And so I had the fortune of meeting other colleagues who were also trying to figure out how to help individuals and families. And together we formed RETIRN, R-E-T-I-R-N, Re-Entry Therapy, Information and Referral Network. And I created this in the United States with my colleagues some decades ago. And since my move to the United Kingdom, I do this work with the next speaker, my husband, who you'll meet shortly. Re-entry therapy. It's different when you've been in a group and then you try to recover. You have to re-enter a society. And actually, if you've been brought up in that group, you have to enter society, because there are special issues for people who have been born and raised in destructive groups. Information. Why information? Normally, when people come to me for therapy, say for depression or anxiety or a relationship problem, I don't have to educate them. They educate me what the problem is that they're facing, and I try to help them explore what they can do to help themselves. It's a little bit different in this work. I'm not just a neutral person deciding should they be in this relationship or not be in a relationship. They're talking about destructive relationships that are stealing their minds and their ability to think critically. So, therefore, information, psychoeducation about undue influence and coercive persuasion is key in this work. And referral network, I've never felt that I could do this work alone. Other specialists might be needed. It could be legal help. It could be people from a particular group. Because as a psychologist, I never set out to understand the dogma and practices of each and every group. And to tell you the truth, I never found that I needed to, because there were other people that had that information, and the psychology of what happens to people, that was something that was in common. And I didn't have to necessarily have that specialist knowledge to help people. So I looked at, with people, at how they were manipulated, how their emotions have been manipulated by destructive groups. And I would like to just mention the thing that's on our mind, James Foley. Let me say what I want to say about that. Society's being manipulated into fear, just like what happens to people in cults. Why? Does it matter that he was beheaded? You know what? It doesn't matter. It matters that he's dead. It doesn't matter exactly how that happened. Does it matter if it was a British person who did it or someone else? No. These are things that raise our fears, because we want to think that they're different kinds of people than the rest of us. They're more brutal than we could possibly be, and that they're others, so that we can make the distinction between us and them. And let me tell you, that is what cultic groups do. And that is why families end up seeing me, because the families became the them, the less than, the people without the special knowledge and information, the people that you either bring them along and recruit them, or they're suddenly worthless. And you think, how could that happen to somebody? But as we've heard, it can happen. Because if you're part of the big thing that's changing the world, a mission, something very important, and your family can't see that way and they're interfering with your ability, then we can disrupt family relationships. And many things can disrupt family relationships, particularly obsessive relationships like addictions. It's very hard to be in a relationship with an addict because it's you, that person, and the substance that's calling to them. So there's an analogy there as well. So I've been working with families for a long time because I have a lot of empathy for these families. I feel their pain is enormous. and I want to do something to help them. But I would like to see governments do more to help families. I would like to see funding for the type of help that people have paid me privately to do. I would like to see retreats and recovery places where people, individuals and families can go. We must not forget the families, because they suffer tremendously by suddenly their person that they care about being wrenched away from them and their identity changing, and everything that they valued is gone. Their sense of history is gone. So I work with families. I help them to evaluate the situation, to decide whether they want to do anything. If they don't need to do anything, sometimes families are more worried than they need to be. This is something that has to be evaluated. And I work a lot with families on communication with their loved one and trying to keep that communication open and not just saying to them, you're in a cultic group, because that really doesn't help. And so another thing that I do, I work with individuals who are not sure whether or not they want to stay in a group. I don't do that much work with those people, but it is a part of what I do. And I work more frequently with people who have left a group and have this re-entry process, because what do they put on their CVs about where they've been? How do they explain themselves? When do you tell your next romantic partner where you came from without worrying that you might be seen as weird or abnormal? So I work with these issues, and I've become very interested in self-care for people that have come out of destructive groups, their families and loved ones, and the professionals that work with them. The work is draining, it's emotional, we feel passionate about it. There may be risks and dangers to working in this area, even as a therapist. Things have happened. Nothing terrible has happened to me, but I could tell you little stories. There are risks. And so I became interested in helping people to work towards self-care in this area. And part of that is having some sense of balance. So your family member is in a group, but you have other family members who are not in a group who also need your attention, because while the person is in the group, life is going on and things are happening. And for people coming out of the groups, they don't know much about self-care, because they may be malnourished, they may be sleep deprived, they've been pulled from educational goals, career goals. They really don't know about how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to make decisions necessarily, because they've been influenced how to make decisions. So these are all areas that I work with people and communicate with colleagues, and have done research in subsequent years about what kinds of things help people that come out of groups who are typically depressed, anxious, lost, grieving their losses because they felt important in the group. They have existential pain. Who am I? What is important? What will make my life meaningful? And dissociation, because the groups foster prolonged states of dissociation, so they're foggy, it's hard to concentrate and focus. And so I work in all these areas, and that has been my privilege to be able to do so and to speak with you today. So thank you for listening to me. And I'd like to turn over to my husband, Professor Dubrow-Marshall.
Thank you, Linda. I'm Lloyd Dubrow-Marshall, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Derby. I'm speaking in a personal capacity today, but I just want to echo the thank you to College, a good partner of the university, and to Mark and colleagues for hosting the event today. I'm also co-editor of the International Journal of Cultic Studies, which is published by the International Cultic Studies Association. There's a wealth of information and research, importantly, about the phenomena of undue influence and cultic groups. And as Linda said, we work together on return, which Linda's spoken about. I'm a social psychologist, and I specialise particularly in the psychoeducational component of recovery, but also working with families whose loved ones are in abusive groups or relationships, and helping family members to understand the nexus that their family members have been caught up in, and sometimes very long road that lies ahead in terms of attempting to help people leave the groups that they are effectively trapped into. Back in 1997, when I was actually working at what's now Bucks University, a student came to me with an idea for her PhD project. She had been, as she self-described it, in a Bible-based cult and wanted to research this further, particularly looking at what it was like to grow up in a group like that. And as a social psychologist who had researched identity issues for many years, I was interested in that issue. And with Lois Kendall, who has done a huge amount of research on second-generation membership, people who grow up in groups over many years, I went with her to conferences in the States of what was then the American Family Foundation, now International Celtic Studies Association. And I remember in 1999 hearing Dennis Turish speak about political cults, because like a lot of people, I thought that cults were like just religious groups, the stereotypes, the groups that people hear about routinely in the media. And I heard Dennis Turish talk about political cults and about democratic centralism, the Marxist-Leninist theory of party building, which sounds very impressive, doesn't it? But I then had the revelation almost that indeed I had been in a political cult myself. I had been for a number of years a member of the far-left group that at the time went under the name of Socialist Organiser, or the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, one of many far-left Trotskyist sects that operated in the United Kingdom and in other countries, including in the States, and in which I'd also regrettably recruited my sister into the group for a while. And that led me then, as a social psychologist, to apply the work that I'd done around the social cognition of identity to the phenomenon of undue influence and cultic groups specifically. And I had the privilege for nearly 10 years to work with the late Dr. Paul Martin at the Wellspring Retreat and Resource Centre in Ohio in the United States, which to this day, I believe, has been the only residential treatment program in the world for people who've survived abusive groups or relationships. A good reason, again, why governments need to listen and fund rehabilitation properly for people who've survived these kind of organisations. But over many years, Wellspring did a really good job for many, many people in terms of their recovery. But importantly, they also measured their clients, both at intake and discharge, on a number of psychometric instruments. And I worked with Paul Martin over a number of years. And we developed together research that demonstrated not only was a psychoeducation-focused recovery program highly efficacious, highly effective for people, levels of depression, dissociation and anxiety significantly fell from intake to discharge. But critically, that level of psychopathology for former group members was significantly related both to the group environment, as measured by the group psychological abuse scale, which is an instrument developed by Chambers, Dole and Grice and Langoni, which is a measure, the only measure really that exists, that measures the level of psychological abuse in a group setting. And also that those measures of psychopathology, depression, dissociation, anxiety, also significantly were related to the extent of the group identity at the time. In other words, the deeper that you believed in the group and were involved in the group, the more there was a level of harm recorded afterwards. And this led us to develop the totalistic identity theory to explain the phenomenon of the cult identity. For most of us who are not in totalistic groups, we have a range of identities at our disposal. We can move seamlessly between supporting our local football team or our college basketball team to supporting our country, being interested in our families and individuals. We move cognitively between these levels without thinking about it. For cult members, that process is kind of put on hold, in stasis, and the group becomes entirely dominant within the person's psychological makeup. And this is not just a hypothesis I put to you. This is actually the outcome of evidence-based research, where we showed through analysing the data collected for over 600 people at Wellspring, through the relationship between the identity and the psychopathology, that there was this phenomenon of a totalistic identity which left its effects psychologically on individuals afterwards in terms of heightened levels of depression, dissociation and related aspects of anxiety. And it's those findings, and in the International Journal of Cultic Study there are many more findings besides, that means that, for me, what's critical is that governments, when presented with that evidence, listen and respond. It's heartening to see in this country recently the fact that the current government is considering a new criminal offence of domestic abuse for the psychological harm inflicted by a partner within a relationship, a development of the current legislation around domestic violence and abuse. And I believe that should be widened towards groups that are harmful towards individuals as well as relationships. But as it currently stands, and I work at a senior level for a major employer in my city, if some of the things that I've seen and heard reported from many, many individuals over the years that take place in abusive groups was allowed to happen in my workplace, then action would be taken. Action would be taken by the government through organisations like the Health and Safety Executive, which now, over many, many years, have actually taken action against people who've been psychologically harmed at work, not just physically harmed, but psychologically harmed also. So I believe that because the evidence is there of that psychological harm, both in the many, many stories, but also in the research that I've spoken of, that it's absolutely essential that governments respond to that by looking, for example, at how health and safety legislation, the duty of care that employers have, should be extended to religious groups, political groups, and to people who go along voluntarily to organisations to either worship or to be politically active. In that sense, and to echo the comments earlier by Lloyd and others, religion or politics should not be a shield behind which abusive practice can hide. There should be no exemption to that duty of care on the basis of belief. Yes, people can believe what they want, that's an important principle, but where that leads to abusive practices that harm people, then religion should not be a protection against organisations being held to account for the actions that they take against individuals. In that sense, I believe that all groups should open up their organisation to scrutiny, should be open to reform. The last time I sat between these individuals on the big questions on BBC television, I put to Simon Cooper from the Unification Church in London, would he open up the Unification Church to research so that the world could be convinced that individuals in his organisation were not being harmed by their practices? And he actually said yes, he would. And I welcomed his answer to that question. And I think it is a duty on those organisations to open themselves up, but moreover for government to make sure, as I said already, that no organisation is exempt from that level of scrutiny and that there shouldn't be interventions to reform groups based on the very clear evidence that exists now that undue influence practices in any organisation, whether it's a religion, political group, or indeed any company or organisation, where it's harmful, then clearly action must be taken. And the root of that, of course, must also be, as others have said, and a deep interest of mine through our school system and education system in terms of how we teach people about those risks as well. So that's my work, and what I believe is terribly important, and the reason for this conference today and for the workshop over the weekend. And it gives me great pleasure to hand over now to Jon Atack.
I became involved in Scientology when I was 19 years old. There were all sorts of promises. We were going to achieve supernatural powers, none of which I've ever seen. We were going to be able to rake in great loads of cash as a matter of willpower. I believed for 9 years. I was an enthusiastic believer. I had the good fortune never to be a living member, so I was not humiliated in the way that most members are. But things became disquieting in the early 1980s with an aggressive attitude coming out from the top, because 11 senior executives of Scientology were sent to prison in the United States for breaking and entering, burglary, theft, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. Most senior of them was the wife of the leader of Scientology, Ron Hubbard. Hubbard himself was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. So I became sceptical and I started to collect evidence. And for the next 7 years, I collected things like Ron Hubbard's FBI files and his Navy files and his Veterans Administration files. But I relied largely upon his own writings, which show massive contradictions. So that, for example, in 1965 he said that he'd been crippled and blinded as a consequence of his injuries in the war. However, in 1950, in an interview with Look magazine, he'd said that he had ulcers, fallen down the ladder and had something wrong with his feet, and that those were his war wounds. His neighbour records actually support that statement. So I left and I did a great deal of research. I helped many other authors write books. I wrote a best-selling book, which I believe is the first and still the only history of a 20th century cult group, which is quite strange because there are tens of books which are ex-member books and there are several books trying to analyse membership. But it's quite unusual for there to be a history properly researched. Scientology, in return for this, harassed me for a period of 16 years on an almost daily level. Protesters marched up and down outside my house with placards. My house was broken into. Agents were run against me. People would come and say that they'd been persecuted in some way by Scientology. At one point, the head of investigation for Scientology defected and told me that there were 5 people in my close circle who were writing reports on me, including the man who used to drive me around. It was a very difficult life. It eventuated in me being bankrupted through litigation costs, not through litigation itself, but through trying to pay lawyers. I lost my house, my health deteriorated. And in 1996, I decided that enough was enough. There was absolutely no government support of any kind, despite the Council of Europe ruling in 1993 saying that all member states must fund information about such groups. By this time, I met Steve here. I met him in 1989. We became good friends. And I became progressively more interested in the nature of undue influence. How is it that I was talking with people in Scientology. We had doctors, we had lawyers, we had dentists, we had PhDs, we had a couple of NASA PhDs. How was it that people who were intelligent could be taken in? Such cult groups do tend to recruit people with, on average, 2 years in university. They're not recruiting people who are stupid. They're recruiting people who are competent and will be able to get money for the cult. Now, sitting here today, Scientology now has $8 billion. $4 billion declared to the IRS and $4 billion in offshore accounts. It has a membership, it claims to have a membership of 11 million. It actually, internal reports show, has a membership of only 25,000. Yet, you'll see, for example, Richard Dawkins talking about it as a major religion. It's managed to persuade society that it's far larger and far more dangerous than it is. It's also managed, until the internet came along, to silence almost all of its opponents. I worked for 12 years and there were only about 3 or 4 other people in the world because harassment is constant. I was accused of rape, I was accused of attempted murder, I was reported for child abuse. These sort of allegations are a standard affect of the intelligence agency, which is at the heart of Scientology. They wish to silence any criticism. I moved over into studying the general principles of undue influence. Let's make a distinction here. I would normally use the term exploitative persuasion, because I don't really think there's such a thing as brainwashing. However, we have a split, that we have many social scientists who, to protect people's liberties, are saying that there is really no such thing as exploitative persuasion. People make free choices and they should be left to do this. On the other hand, we have a legal tradition which stretches back in this country to the 16th century, where it is accepted that if you give something to your lawyer, to your doctor, to your priest, to your counsellor, you can ask for it back. And they have to explain why they should be allowed to keep it. We also, of course, have selling rules, so that if you sign a contract, you have a certain cooling off period. So in law, we have the acceptance of undue influence, but generally in society, we don't. And I, in the last 20 years, since I wrote a piece of blue sky in my book, have looked at other groups. So, for example, if you look at what is called radicalisation, of Muslims, we find that many experts are saying, well, there are no dynamics to this. We've got this ridiculous thing called the bunch of guys hypothesis, put forward in Canada and accepted by several experts who are advising government, which is that a group of young Muslims get together, play football, go and have a pizza, and decide to bomb something. They dismiss Steve's work, particularly in the late Margaret Singer, without even looking at the dynamics of influence. I would aver that we are all influenced by what's going on around us. There's a piece in New Scientist last week which said that we are bombarded with 100,000 words of persuasion per day in modern society. So we have spin, we have advertising. And some people think, well, none of this has any influence at all. But the studies tend to show that that's not the case, that by hammering home messages you can change people's beliefs. For example, look at Nazi Germany, where 180,000 patients were murdered by their own doctors in the run-up to World War II. 45% of medical practitioners joined the Nazi Party in Germany. So you have a cultic phenomenon there. You have a cultic phenomenon which is running rife in the world today. It's not only a matter of radicalisation, that we're not proofing people up. We're not showing them how not to collaborate with people who wish to manipulate them. And we're not teaching them about ever more subtle means of manipulating them. So, for example, Coca-Cola and other companies, for the last 15 years, have been using brain scanning while they do their surveys. So it's not a matter of we ask you a question and you make an answer. We see what happens in your brain if you really think, and we then target people based upon that. I've looked at radicalisation, I've also looked at gangs, and when you look at gang formation, you find exactly the same dynamics that you find in any other form of cult. You look at the Crips and the Bloods and how they came about, or indeed go back, there's an excellent book called Gangs of Manchester, about gangs in the 1870s, where it's stunningly like the Crips in terms of their tattoos and their insignia and the fights that they get into and what they believe. So my interest, I've come back and I'm doing some work with ex-Scientologists. I've counselled about 600 ex-members now. I've seen people who've gone through post-traumatic stress disorder as they come out of the cult. They've come to feel that their lives are pointless because they have this wonderful, as they call it, star-high goal of saving the world, and they now realise that they were tricked and deceived, that all they were doing was pouring money into the bank account of Ron Hubbard and currently David Miscavige. It can take people many years to recover. In fact, two experts, Conway and Siegelman, said of Scientology has the most debilitating set of rituals of any cult in America, and that they anticipated recovery time unaided to be 12.5 years. I would say they were wrong. It's not 12.5 years. For the most part, people who've been involved in something this invasive do not recover without help. They go to their graves with this stuff still restricting them and preventing them from helping society, because these are often good people, competent people who've been diverted away from the path of help. I would also say that this isn't a problem simply of radicalisation, of gangs, of cults. This is a problem at the heart of our society. It's a problem that we find political parties who are perfectly willing to use deception and spin to convince us of ideas. It's a problem we find in our educational system, because the educational system is still largely obedience-based, rather than being based upon critical thinking and teaching kids to be compassionate, creative, and to think, and to ask questions and say, no, this isn't the right thing. And as Linda can tell you, there are many studies that have shown that if people will comply with social pressures, if we taught children about that, if we taught them to stop and think about things and to discuss things openly and to think critically, we could change society. We could make it so that when somebody seeks to radicalise a young Muslim, they say, hang on a minute, that doesn't add up. But at the moment, we no longer teach any critical thinking in our schools. The rhetoric, which was taught from the Middle Ages into the 20th century, has left the curriculum. So people aren't taught how to analyse, how to evaluate, and how to articulate. I'd like to see that as a change. Having said that, I'm going to hand over to a man who is certainly one of the world's leading experts on these problems, Mr. Stephen Hassan.
I'm honored to be here with this distinguished panel, and I guess I feel like Jon is to Scientology what I am to the Moonies, and maybe Masoud is to MEK, and maybe Lloyd is to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and maybe for you, Rod, your former cult as well. The news is ISIL or ISIS, the Islamic State terrorist group, and all the media is talking about how we need to bomb them, or how the people who beheaded the journalist Foley are psychopaths and pirates. But in my opinion, the media, the general public, governments are all missing the core feature, which everyone's been sharing today, is that we live in a world of psychological sophistication about how the brain works, about how people can be influenced, and how an individual or a group can systematically take an intelligent person and break them down and build them up in the image of the cult leader, whether it's a religious cult, a political cult, a therapy cult, a business cult, whatever. The science exists, and I've written 3 books on the subject. I'm probably the dinosaur of the people at the panel, because when I got out, thanks to my family's intervention through a deprogramming of the moon cult in 1976, the major thing that helped me wake up, aside from meeting former members, one of whom I had recruited into the cult and who had left, the main thing that woke me up was the brainwashing studies of former military intelligence officials of the United States government looking into communist Chinese thought reform programs. And indeed, I went and Robert J. Lifton, Margaret Singer, Lewis West, Edgar Schein, all were mental health professionals for the U.S. government, studying brainwashing, writing about it, explaining how it works. Back in the 50s, the intention was, what can we do to inoculate our troops if they're taken advantage of? But in the height of the Cold War, as America was being pressured to leave Vietnam, it became part and parcel of the armament of the Cold War to use this methodology, to use deception to recruit people. And that's a key point, lack of informed consent. It's a key principle of religious freedom. If we don't know what it is we're getting into, how do we have free will? How do we have free choice? We do not. I took Lifton's model, I took Singer's model, I took West's model. They were all very ivory tower, and I kind of reorganized it into what I refer to as the BITE model, B-I-T-E. It's in the press pack for those in the room. It's going to be on the website along with the videotape. It's on my website, freedomofmind.com as well. And basically the BITE model stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I describe a whole set of sub-variables under each of these organizing principles, like sleep deprivation. One of the most researched things in science and in medicine is sleep. Chronic application of destructive cults is to keep people busy and not sleeping adequately. You cannot think analytically if you're so tired, and you keep people so busy. It's a key feature. So you can kind of imagine a continuum. There's an imaginary line here with the arrow going towards ethical, constructive social influence, which we all need. I'm a parent of an 11-year-old. I've got to influence my kid to grow up to be a healthy young man. But on this side, it's destructive influence. This side, it's about empowering people to be themselves, their authentic selves, to have their own creativity, to have their own identity, to have their own free will. It's with respect, it's with love, it's with honesty, it's with accountability and responsibility. On this side, though, it's about cloning, It's about dependency and obedience. It's about fear. It's about threats. It's the dark side. And I might go back, Rod was talking about the totalistic identity disorder. Robert Lifton, whose seminal book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, that outlined 8 criteria of mind control, later did a book called The Nazi Doctors. I'm also cueing off of what John was talking about, medical doctors. He wanted to understand how could medical doctors sworn to heal and help kill people and do the most horrendous experiments on innocent people, and he called it doubling. In my book, in 1988, I talked about John, and John cult member. I know, very crude, but I really was Steve Hassan, son of Milton and Estelle Hassan. And then when I got recruited into the cult, I became Steve Hassan, son of Sun Myung Moon and Hak Ja-han, the true parents of the universe. And this new cult identity suppressed my real identity very systematically. And I threw away my poetry to misquote the Bible. You were quoting the Bible. I was told, do I love God enough to sacrifice my Isaac? My Isaac was my poetry because I was a creative writing major in college. Would I throw out 400 original poems to show my allegiance to God? And I did. And they're gone forever. But I proved that I was faithful, right? But the real Steve would never have done that. The real Steve believed in question authority. Remember back then. I know I'm dating myself, but that was the theme. There were bumper stickers. Question authority. That was me. Nixon was a crook. Then I get into the cult. Moon says God wants Nixon to be president. We're all going to Washington, D.C. to fast for Nixon for 3 days. So I'm fasting for Nixon to be president because God wants Nixon to be president. And my father, who I thought was going to be happy because he was a Nixon supporter, said, Steve, you are right. He's a crook. I said, Dad, you don't understand. God wants to be... He said, Steve, now I know you're brainwashed. The guy's a crook. And I was trained to do thought stopping. It's one of the B-I-T-E, thought stopping. I was trained to believe that any doubt was from Satan, from evil spirits, and I was trained to do a behavior modification technique to shut off my critical thinking and to keep this cult identity intact. And it's exactly what I believe is happening with these Islamic terrorist groups. For the most part, they're good people, I believe. Yes, maybe they're discontent, maybe they're not getting jobs, maybe they're frustrated, they've been persecuted, whatever. I have a last name that's Hassan, so I know a little bit about people who treat Arabs in a condescending, negative way, being a Jew, which is another interesting thing that I experienced. But the point is it's so easy with the way we function as human beings to blame the victim or to do what social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, to say it's something in the person that makes them weak or vulnerable or needing a leader, as opposed to the social environmental influences that are done to them in a systematic way to bring them in and keep them in. So I mentioned sleep deprivation as one example of behavior control. I use deception and lack of informed consent as one example of information control. There are many. I use thought stopping as one example of thought manipulation. And I want to end this brief talk and invite questions. Phobia indoctrination is one of the key principles under emotional control. The deliberate and systematic implantation of irrational fears that if you question the leader or violate the policies of the group, terrible things are going to happen to you. You're going to go insane, you're going to get cancer, you're going to be hit by a car. I have 4 pages of the most common phobias that I've encountered in the last 38 years that I've helped people recover from. We need to have fear when there's real danger, right? But they trick the amygdala into believing that there's danger when there's no danger. And it's part of this invisible psychological bars that are put inside of people. As a mental health professional, I would say it's a dissociative disorder, where this cult identity is suppressing the person's real identity. And I further want to just say, I believe that people born into cults have an authentic self that's suppressed. It's not like they don't have it, it's just that they were not given an environment to nurture and bring that up. For those people who rebelled anyway, they walk out of these groups, but as Jon correctly said, you can walk out physically of the group, but it's still programmed in your neurons unless you consciously re-examine and, in a sense, re-educate yourself to healthy principles. And that's the thrust of my work, is the way to recover from destructive undue influence is to control your own mind, to know yourself, to know how the mind works, to understand, to have a toolbox of influence techniques, so that we can be good citizens. We can act in a responsible, loving way and care for each other and care for this planet and take care of our children and start making good decisions and not just reactive to what the media, the information influences that are coming at us that are skewed. And it really, so Masoud said we got to inoculate people who are potential new recruits. I totally agree. I agree we need critical, thinking skills to be taught as part of that. But I think we need more. And I'll just mention two other things that I think need to be implemented. I think ex-members of other destructive cults are one of the keys to the solution. Why? Because when you're in a mind control cult or an undue influence cult, you think you're doing the right thing, you're following God, or you're following the truth, but it's easy to see other cults as bad and stupid, right? Because you're not being trained to do thought stopping against them. So you can see it over there, right? So if we want to help people get out of one cult, expose them to people and their testimonies of other cults, I believe that ex-members are like white blood cells and corpuscles that are going to help the immune system of the human species to survive. And one other thing that I'll throw out is that when people get recruited by a radical extremist cult group of any kind, including Islamic, friends notice it and parents notice it, but they don't know what to do. They try to argue, rationally argue with them and convince them to leave, which usually backfires and polarizes and sends the person faster and deeper into the cult and isolates them. They're afraid to turn to the police or anyone else because they don't want to get their loved one in trouble. And they're paralyzed. And we need to have non-governmental private entities where people can get help and can get coaching, and that's part of my work, is teaching family members and friends how to communicate to people who have totalistic identity disorder, like that term, because I believe that the human spirit wants to be free. We don't like to be lied to, we don't like to be exploited, we don't want to be abused deep down inside, and if people treat us with respect, people will be responsive. So I just, and we've gone an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience. We can open it up for questions. But there are things we can be doing actively. We need to learn more, and then we need to teach it, and we need to really think about implementing something that's going to make a difference. And thank you for Dick Kelly for putting this together, of AWA, AAWA.co.